Honored key speakers, esteemed discussant and dear audience. My name is Anna-Maija Poikkeus. I'm currently working as the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Psychology at the University of Jyväskylä, and I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to the second seminar in a series seeking to promote Indo-Finnish collaboration in teaching and learning. The series is organized by the Global Innovation Network for Teaching and Learning, in short GINTL or GINTL, especially the one which is focusing on India, and Nordic Centre of India. GINTL India is a network in which higher education institutions from Finland, together with partners and counterparts from India, seek together to co-create research-based solutions for development of learning, teaching, curricula, learning environments, and educational systems. The theme of today's webinar is reforming teacher education in the 21st century. We are going to hear a dialogue on, for instance, topics of teacher competence and policy reforms. It is of great relevance to sort of discuss what we mean by teacher competence and how we foster them in both initial teacher training and at the in-service phase. Needs for upskilling of teachers becomes especially critical in the times of teacher education reforms, such as, for instance, the recent national education policy of India, as well as the recent reforms in Finland concerning extension of pre-primary education and the new mandate concerning upper secondary education. Today we have a pleasure of hearing keynotes by two distinguished speakers, and then we have a discussion with commentators who are presenting questions to the speakers. Our moderator for the event today is a highly experienced member of our academic staff at the University of Jyväskylä, University lecturer Pasi Ikonen, with extensive experience on pedagogical development and international collaboration. You're all very welcome, and Pasi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna-Maija, and also warmly welcome everyone on my behalf. I have a pleasure to introduce two excellent keynote speakers today. First one, Professor Mythili Ramchand. She's currently a professor and a co-chairperson at the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, India. Before joining Tata Institute, she was the director of RE Educational Consortium, Bangalore. Her research interests are in the areas of philosophy of education, initial teacher preparation, inclusive education, and mediation of resources in teaching and learning process. Professor Mithili has led a number of collaborative projects and research studies in India and internationally. Currently, she is leading a Government of India-supported research on comparative study of initial teacher education in the BRICS countries, in partnership with University of Sussex. Professor has offered her consultancy to a number of organizations and been in a panel of committees on teacher education curriculum renewal and reforms. So please, Professor, the floor is yours, and we are happy to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for this very kind introduction, Pasi. May I have the presentation, please? I'm going to focus largely on the initial teacher education sector. That is my area of work primarily. So we'll be looking at some of the contexts of teacher education in India. My colleagues from India will be very familiar with these contexts, and I will beg your pardon for repeating many of the points that you're already familiar with. But I thought it was important to set the context before we move on to what teacher education quality is and how is it conceptualized in the policies programs and practices within the country. And we'll briefly look at the current status of teachers and teacher education. Am I audible? All right. And move on to the standards for teachers and teaching that the country is gearing towards. And briefly end with some suggestions for reforming teacher education in the 21st century, which is the theme of today's discussion. The next slide, please. So when it comes to the context of teachers and teacher education in India, as you're aware, the numbers are huge. There are 9.7 million teachers across grade levels in the country. And if you look at the proportion of teachers, more than 80% are teaching at the grade levels 1 to 10. And in terms of teacher education institutions, there are at present, as of 2021-22, 16,754 institutions that are recognized by the regulatory authority in the country. And most of them are private standalone institutions. By standalone, we mean institutions that offer only the B.Ed or the DL.Ed program. And as you are aware, initial teacher education in the country is highly regulated, and the National Council for Teacher Education is the regulatory authority that was set up by the Parliament in 1993. So moving on to give a very brief overview of the quality of teachers and teacher education as conceptualized in the policies. Ours is again a colonial legacy, again a fact that all of you are familiar with, and many of the structures continued well into the modern nation state of India. And it was only towards the middle and the late 1990s that the structures were altered to some extent. The first national education policy of India had recognized early on that teachers are important to shape the country and the aspirations for the newly independent country. And this often quoted text, the policy begins with this line: the destiny of India is now being shaped in her classrooms. And I must say that 50 years on, this still continues to inspire many who are in the education sector. Then there was a National Commission on Teachers that was set up in 1983. It was popularly known as the Chattopadhyay Commission. And in a very evocative report, it is titled Teacher and the Society. And it positions teachers and teaching within the socio-political context of the country at that point in time. And they point out that the basic problem with teachers has been that it is not backed up by any systematic field. I'm sorry, the problem with teacher education has been that it is not backed up by systematic field research to validate the training programs or the curriculum of the initial teacher education programs. And this, the committee points out, has led to gaps between theory and practice, and essentially the commission critiques that the choice of the content of the curriculum is largely determined by tradition or the interest of the teacher educators themselves, and by armchair thinking, as the report puts it. But more importantly, the Commission identifies teachers as partners in meeting the national goals based on the preamble of the Indian Constitution. And many of the recommendations of the first National Commission has been taken up by another national commission that was set up in 2012 called the Justice Verma Committee on Teacher Education. They reiterate many of the recommendations of the first National Commission. Then 1986 was also the year when the second National Policy of Education was brought in, and largely this policy and the subsequent program of action that was brought out in 1992 is responsible for creating sub-district structures for teacher education and bringing in a centrally sponsored scheme for teacher education, where financing of teacher education really was brought into the country. The current national education policy, of course, was drafted in 2020, and it makes many recommendations regarding teacher education. There is a separate section on teacher education in the policy, and there are at least 13 recommendations in the policy that directly affects initial teacher education. Moving on, I just have these two quotes from the second national education policy and the current one to give us all a sense of the persistence of some of the problems that we continue to face, and also the aspiration of the policy framers in terms of how these problems can be addressed. So the second NPE says that the problems continue to remain because adequate responsibilities and financial support was not provided to implement the policy. And the current national education policy appears to lay the blame in not adequately thinking through aspects of quality and focusing primarily on access and equity. There are critiques within the Indian researchers and scholars who point out to the fact that neoliberal tendencies had creeped in even during the second national policy on education, and the subtle shift towards performativity and the need for teacher education institutions especially to showcase certain outputs as against the core inputs and processes that are required for bringing in reforms in teacher education. And the current national policy definitely extends that further, the aspect of a neoliberal management kind of thinking. Moving on, in terms of the number of teacher education programs. So as you can see in the table, the maximum offerings of the teacher education programs are the 2-year diploma in elementary education, which students take up after their higher secondary schooling, and the 2-year B.Ed program, which is the Bachelor in Education program, which students take up after their undergrad degree. So admission to B.Ed program has remained remarkably stable over the last 5 years. This belies the fear when the B.Ed program was extended to 2 years from a 1-year program. This was made mandatory in 2014 by NCTE. The intake in the diploma in elementary education has reduced concomitantly in the past 5 years, but then the patterns vary across states. For example, this year, Kerala has seen a surge in the admissions to diploma in elementary education since government recruitment of teachers for primary schools has been announced. So the admission is strongly linked to the appointment of teachers in the government sector at the states. So I already spoke to you about NEP's recommendations in teacher education. So one of the recommendations is a move towards a 4-year integrated program post the higher secondary, and also keeping open the option for the 2-year B.Ed for mid-career transitions. And NEP suggests a 1-year B.Ed as well for those who completed a 4-year undergrad program in another discipline. So these are some of the tracks that the national education policy opens up. Moving on, in terms of initiatives to address quality, to improve quality of teachers and teacher education, better pay structure has been recommended right from the first education policy. And many states have improved the pay structure of the teachers, but then it again varies across states. Teacher eligibility test as a mandatory requirement for fresh recruitment was announced, and initial teacher education preparation is compulsory as per the Right to Education Act. So anyone seeking appointment in a school has to have a initial teacher education qualification, either a diploma or a B.Ed, for example. Reforms were initiated in teacher education curriculum. The 2009 National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education attempts to align teacher education to the National Curriculum Framework of School Education that brought in widespread and broad sweeping reforms in the school education sector. The National Mission on Teachers and Teaching was announced in 2014, and they have been supporting with grants many teacher education institutions and setting up of resource centers and faculty development programs for teacher educators. Continuing professional development opportunities have been made available through the centrally sponsored scheme post the second National Education Policy. And currently that scheme has subsumed under the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, which combines the school education and the teacher education in a continuum. And support structures for the continuous professional development of teachers exist at the district and the sub-district levels. The next slide, please. So in terms of practices in teacher education, we find that the practice teaching component has been compulsory for almost 3 decades now, but it is conceptualized more as an add-on rather than as the core for teacher preparation. And the current NCTE regulations mandate a 20-week internship program. Then there has been a general neglect of content knowledge in the teacher preparation program, the assumption being that content will be learned in their undergrad programs. Now, to address this, NEP has proposed a shift to a concurrent model, as I already mentioned in the previous slide. Now, there has been a fragmentation of curriculum, not just in India, but in many other countries across the globe, which has led to a disconnect between the foundations and the methods course on the one hand, and the theoretical and practical knowledge on the other. And the National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education in 2009 does attempt to address it, but the way it has been conceptualized as curriculum by different states, again, are very varied. There is sparse research of teacher education programs and practices in the country, and we really need more evidence in terms of what works. There is inadequate engagement of key stakeholders and consideration of local context and resource in reform efforts in the country, and generally uncritical adoption of the standards discourse is what we find. The next slide, please. So some of the core challenges in bringing in reforms in teacher education, curriculum and practice has really to do with inadequate, good quality resources to prepare our teachers, especially in the local languages. And this has again been a point that has been made by the Chattopadhyay Commission way back in 1985. But we've not done enough to address this. There do exist quite a few isolated attempts to bring in more resources into teacher education, but it's just not sufficient to meet the number and scale that is required in the country. And teacher education institutions have generally been isolated, and that has been quite problematic. And inadequate professional development opportunities for teacher educators has again been a problem for the country. How am I doing on time?
Yes, you still have time left.
All right, thank you. So in terms of the current status of teachers and teacher education, one of the primary factors that has been problematic in the country is the fact that state provisioning of initial teacher education program has been minimal. So as we saw, more than 92% of the teacher education institutions in the country are privately run. Of course, the state does provide considerable resources for the continuous professional development of teachers, but if we look at teacher development in a continuum, it's important for state provisioning of the initial teacher education program as well, since it is mandatory in the country also. Then there is also the problem of not being able to attract talent for the teacher education programs. So this is again something that has been constantly brought to the notice of the country right from the first education policy. And many scholars point out that over-regulation of teacher education has stifled innovations in the country when it comes to the initial teacher preparation. Then when it comes to the status of teachers, there is a negligible career growth path for a teacher. And the emergence of para-teachers in the late 90s has also considerably led to the depletion of the status of teachers. Increasingly, we find feminization of the profession, but it is widely varied across grades, with more women teachers in the primary grades and in the special education sector, and definitely in the urban areas across levels, you find more women teachers. The next slide, please. So India has recently started moving towards defining standards. Of course, norms and standards were part of what the NCTE stipulated for teacher education institutions and programs right from when it was constituted. They were made mandatory. So before NCTE was constituted as a regulatory body, it existed as in an advisory capacity right from 1973 onwards. And certainly this idea of standards has been around, but the way in which it is being morphed into and conceptualized specifically in terms of teacher knowledge, skills and disposition is of a recent occurrence. So internationally, if you look at standards, the opinions vary. It has been viewed as something that supports teacher professional development and providing potential pathways for career progression for teachers. to some scholars who question the attempt of standards to bottle the phenomenon of teacher quality, as Meg Maguire puts it. According to the National Education Policy 2020's recommendation, NCTE is now taking up the role of a professional standard setting body for teachers and teaching in the country. A draft standards framework has been prepared, and it is in the process of being circulated for wider dissemination, and it would be piloted as well. Moving on. Some of the issues with standards has been the proliferation of edu businesses for raising standards. Increasingly, we see that in school education, and it has started trickling into teacher education sector as well. So in the particular context in which the standards framework is being developed currently, it is really in an atmosphere of what is called as the discourse of derision, where teachers are often blamed for the lack of quality in the learning outcomes of students, both by the media as well as the state officials. Then there are contradictions within the reform efforts in the country. On the one hand, you have academicians who are attempting to bring in qualitative reforms in a much broader perspective. And on the other hand, there are policy directives which undermines the professional autonomy of teachers. So this is a tension that we have been facing in the country. So looking at literature on standards in countries that have had standards for more than 3 decades now, we find that the impact on the classroom practices and student learning has been very mixed, to say the least. And the link between teacher learning, teaching practices, and student outcomes are really quite complex, and attempting to make a linear connection between them can be quite counterproductive for the quality of teacher education. Standards can have the danger of narrowing the scope of teaching and disempower teachers, and can be seen as a means of external control in a situation where teacher autonomy is already quite weakened. And then we need to really think about, do we need teachers who are directed professionals, directed by the state, or are we going to envisage teachers as agents of change and who can bring in transformation, especially when it comes to social justice issues? And we find increasingly that successful school systems across the globe prioritize recruitment, education, and recognition of teachers, and adequate resources for good quality teaching. And we constantly look to Finland on this matter, of course. Moving on. So in terms of reforming teacher education in the 21st century, we have to recognize that teacher standards cannot exist in isolation, and they have to be integrated within the larger education system that exists in the country. As Linda Darling-Hyman points out, standards are not magic bullets to improve teacher quality. The standards framework must actually be aspirational and not prescriptive, and must ensure accountability both bottom-up as well as top-down. The system has to be equally accountable to the teachers in terms of making, for example, the working conditions in schools, as a recent UNESCO 2021 report on the status of teachers points out. Then the teacher education providers and teacher organizations and networks that are quite robust in the country have to take the lead in implementing standards to avoid the danger of top-down efforts. The next slide, please. So again, it should not be an evaluative approach within the performative culture that we are working in currently. And definitely the conditions and contexts under which teachers work and under which institutions function are very varied in this vast country. And most importantly, long-term commitment from both national and state governments to sustainably support and resource teacher education is essential. So are cohesive policies for systemic reform efforts to improve educational quality, particularly for the marginalized. That's it from me. These are a few select references that I've put up there. I'm happy to share the entire list. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ramchand, for this very interesting notes and comments about development and current situation, but also the future of this vast country and complex culture. Our next keynote speaker could be described to be one of the key influencers of Finnish teacher education development. Dr. Jari Lavonen is a professor of science education at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Sorry, University of Helsinki, definitely. He's currently a director of the National Teacher Education Forum and a chair of the Finnish Matriculation Examination Board. Professor Lavonen has been researching science and teacher education for over 31 years. He has been active in the development of teacher education in several countries internationally, including Norway, Peru, and South Africa. So please warmly welcome Professor Lavonen. The floor is yours.
So I hope you can now see my slides. So, okay, excellent. Good afternoon. Happy to share experiences from Finland. And first of all, I would like to emphasize that there is no right system for organizing education, and in this context, of course, organizing teacher education. Everything depends a lot of the history and traditions and the context and how the families, what are the family relation to the education and so on and so on. So we should remember that always when we are comparing and discussing about different systems. And OECD recommend that maybe it's better to analyze processes than structures as such. So in my presentation, I will focus what kind of process we have had recently in Finland, while we have engaged teacher educators in collaborative planning of the national teacher education aims. It is very bottom-up type of approach, and the previous speaker made a reference to Linda Darling-Hammond, and I remember that she was emphasizing in one of her papers that it is possible to have that kind of bottom-up type of approach if you are collaboratively planning the aims and there is collaboration in local level, and what is most crucial is that we are having well-educated teachers. Of course, there are certain characteristics or structures that are very important for teacher education. So we need competent teachers, teacher educators, principals in all levels of education. The professional learning is important. We should emphasize the professional learning competencies in the initial teacher education. We should share common understanding where to go and how to go. And open dialogue, interaction and collaboration are important. So they are from the OECD report, what are the kind of key issues we have to remind. And as it was already discussed in the previous presentation, we are looking for high quality teachers who are educated in high quality programs all over the world. However, our understanding what is a quality teacher varies. There are different interpretation of that concept. And even the terminology we are using, there is a variation. In some countries, we are looking for professional teachers, quality teachers. In some countries, we are looking for effective teachers. And actually, these two, effective, professional, maybe they could be interpreted as a kind of ends in the continuum of the understanding of the quality teacher. So that professional teacher, it belongs to kind of input type of thinking, so that we are aiming to emphasize the input. So we are aiming to educate teachers well. We are aiming to make our aims for teacher education well. And then we trust them and let them do quite autonomously their job. Of course, this kind of professional teacher concept doesn't exist as such. It depends a lot of the state policy, how the state understands the role of universities and teachers, how the school side environment at school is supportive for teacher professionalism. In the output type of thinking, countries who are following that ideology, they are more controlling the output. They are organizing testing for education. They are having heavy school inspectorate. They are testing the teachers, evaluating them frequently. So the controlling the outcome is characterizing if the teacher is a good quality teacher or low quality teacher. So in Finland, as I mentioned, we are more looking this professional teacher direction, and it means that we are planning together and emphasizing the initial teacher education. So now I'm describing what we have done during the last 7 years in Finland in order to kind of establish a common understanding what are aims for teacher education. And collaboration is of course important, but collaboration need also output, or actually input in this case. So it needs input from the teacher education, teaching research. It needs input from the local stakeholders, opinions of the organizers of education, teacher union, and that kind of important stakeholders should be listened also. So in our case in Finland, before we were outlining the aims for teacher education in 2016, we organized a literature review. But actually, before I'm going to literature review, I should say something about what is known about successful process. So there is research how to plan teacher education aims or standards, as they are also called. So the consensus through collaboration is one topic that is mentioned, and also the kind of support to professional learning that should be taken into account in the beginning. And pilot projects are important while we are making new aims, learning from practice, making some changes to the original aims, and a lot of versatile communication channels, face-to-face meeting, brainstorming activities through internet, and local meetings all over the Finland. So that kind of what the research is telling us about the successful process while making national aims for teacher education. Also, the OECD have outlined the successful process characteristics in the TALIS project. Last time the TALIS was publishing the teacher survey data, they outline what might be the good process at the national level when we are outlining the aims for teacher education. So OECD emphasized the careful timing. So typically in a country there is a government which is in power some 4 or 5 years. So there should be time in the one government period, time for planning and time for implementation. In our case, we used 1 year for planning and 3 years for implementation. And during the next government, we continued with a rather similar process. The consensus is important, discussion, and seriously looking for consensus. Stakeholders involvement, so like teacher unions and municipality unions, and especially partnership with unions is important from the OECD point of view. Resources are needed for implementation, so pilot projects should be given money, resources for doing research, how the new ideas are working in practice, and then we learn how they are working, and then we can make some improvements. And piloting, I mentioned. So then, of course, the dissemination of the outcomes of the pilots. So in Finland, we have had actually 2 periods when our National Teacher Education Forum has been active in outlining the national aims. The first period was during the previous government, and now during the current government, we have continued our work. In the beginning, the Ministry of Education and Culture nominate 100 experts to the forum. So there were people from the universities, applied universities, because part of the teacher education is organized by applied universities. I already mentioned the literature review, but it's here now. So we made a literature review, and actually it was done by Auli Tuom and Jukka Husu, who were just recently working with research on teacher education, so they back the current literature about teacher education. We were benchmarking some neighbor countries like Norway, Sweden, Estonia especially. We organized a national brainstorming. It's important to hear all stakeholders, teacher educators, and then coming in consensus, in collaboration to national aims. The strategy in 2016 it included a vision, so it was quite global vision, so good education for the whole globe, that kind of vision. 3 main aims, and under the 3 aims there were some sub-aims, and 6 actions, so important areas we have to make progress. And then we made implementation through about 50 pilot projects, national seminars, and also the quality work inside as a part of the process. So we were frequently collecting feedback from the current situation at the universities, and especially in the pilot projects. It's important to recognize challenges. What are the challenges we are aiming to overcome while we are stating the new national aims? We were recognizing challenges in Finnish education in 4 levels. So the student level, active learning process, and also the learning outcomes. For example, in Finland, the difference between boys and girls in reading competence is huge. The most biggest in OECD. So there are challenges in our system. Students' active engagement in learning and well-being, especially the well-being was recognized to be low in, for example, in upper secondary girls. In classroom levels, our latest curriculum was emphasizing the inclusive type of education and the integration of the transversal competencies to the teaching and learning. So they are actually the classroom level issues, how a teacher can integrate the learning of transversal 21st century competencies to the classroom level actions. At the city level, how to organize quality work, and one of the major challenges in Finnish education is the leadership activities, how to engage teachers also to leadership activities, kind of understanding that leadership belongs to all. Society level, especially those great challenges like climate change and pandemics and that kind of things. So the better interaction between pre-service and in-service teacher education. In the literature review, of course, there were a lot of outcomes, but I just take 3 examples. And one example is the coherence in teacher education. there is quite nice recent research related to the coherence. For example, how the teachers who are teaching at the faculty and how the teachers who are mentoring the teaching practice, how well they understand the common aims and how well they understand what is happening in different places in teacher education. And then the pedagogy. It's not enough that we are having a nice programs, nice description of the courses and seminars, but also the pedagogy, what is used. And the willingness and competence for personal learning, professional learning, but also the kind of progress, how to make progress at the school site. And different models for teacher knowledge was also used. This is a simple model, values, education system, how it works, and the domains of teacher knowledge, and also this kind of professional learning. The national brainstorming, we invite teacher educators, stakeholders, looking for same direction, hopefully, and generating ideas, actually, generating ideas what is important in teacher education. And this national brainstorming includes two phases. First, the generation phase, and then the evaluation phase. So everybody should first generate ideas and then evaluate, rank some ideas of other people. And this system we were using, it had a kind of artificial intelligence, and it was able to combine single ideas to the bigger group of ideas, and also it was able to allocate the ideas to the participants in a way that it can summarize what is the outcome of the brainstorming. The outcome of the brainstorming include something similar that was in the literature review, but there was also coming out something that was not yet so much emphasized in the research on teacher education and teachers. For example, kind of innovative orientation in teacher profession, kind of transformative competencies, and role of partnerships and networks in teacher job. And then putting things together, this literature review, a lot of discussions at the national and local level, brainstorming, benchmarkings, we come to kind of common consensus understanding what are the domains of aims in teacher education for the next 10 years. So typically 10 years is a period when we are making new aims, national aims for teacher education. So kind of broad and solid knowledge base, expertise in generating novel ideas and innovation. It includes kind of teacher agency and transformative competencies, and then competencies for development of own and school site. The solid knowledge base include knowledge of competencies in the field of subject matter, pedagogical content knowledge, general pedagogical knowledge, learning, engagement and diversities, understanding and competence in those fields, collaboration and interaction, networking, research skills, ethics, society relations, that kind of, it is not a whole list, but some examples. In Finland, the teachers are responsible for making the national curriculum and learning environments development in that field, so they have had the competence in that field. And for also kind of resilience and kind of ideas how to support students to learn those grand challenges like climate change and loss of in biodiversity, and also the pandemic time. So that kind of competencies belongs to that area. And then I was already mentioned that the kind of competence for professional learning and competence for making progress at the school level. When I compare to some international examples like professional standards in Australia, I can easily see that they are quite similar elements like personal knowledge and practices and personal engagement. Maybe some kind of transformative and innovative orientation is a little bit missing here. But basically the similar. When I compare the Finnish teacher education aims to the, for example, the OECD learning compass, I can see that there is the cognitive field is quite well. So the kind of critical thinking skill, creative thinking skills, socio-emotional learning, and also know-how and know what type of things. So this kind of comparison is useful, but unfortunately time is not enough for making full. So the implementation I already mentioned, maybe I have to skip this one, but it was also important not only have a national aims, but have also resources for the implementation and learn from implementation. And maybe the kind of innovations that were created in the pilot project, maybe that was on one side, but maybe the pilot project were more important for teacher educators' professional learning. So how to support us, teacher educators, in professional learning. So this kind of common research activities which are in collaboration with several universities and stakeholders, they are important for ourselves. And these are examples of our national meetings. And I mentioned that the monitoring is important and kind of continuous quality culture in this kind of project. So we were monitoring how well the pilot project were working, and we were communicating the outcomes, and the pilot project leaders were able to make a reflection how well they were successful in running the pilot projects. So now I have gone through this kind of example from Finland, how we have been working in collaboration and in consensus for national aims for teacher education, and how the ideas have been implemented, and how this kind of pilot project working has been supportive for professional learning of teacher educators. So let me summarize in a nutshell what might be important at the national level. So we should be aware of the challenges and needs. So that was important in the beginning to look what are the problems in our system and how we are planning to overcome those. Timing is important, enough time for planning, but absolutely enough time for implementation. Engaging teachers, teacher educators, stakeholders, so the consensus is important. Sustainable resources for piloting, and research orientation in the making progress in teacher education. This is very interesting that our Ministry of Education and Culture, those people who are participating in this activity, they are always now emphasizing the research orientation in the making progress in teacher education. The quality work as a part of the process and project, and holistically at the same time was happening the development of the new school curricula. So the curricula and teacher education reform happened somehow together. So thank you for sharing these experiences, and very happy to participate in the discussion now.
Thank you, Professor Lavonen, for this very clear presentation of our development. We have now 3 discussants who are already eagerly waiting to make questions to our keynote speakers. And our first expert is Johanna Lampinen, international education designer from the Faculty of Education in the University of Poland. And each discussants have approximately 10 minutes to make questions and have a dialogue with our keynote speakers. So, Johanna, please.
Thank you very much for both professors for your interesting speeches, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to ask questions. So I think that somehow for me, the competencies and this kind of idea when I was a young and bright teacher. I worked as a teacher in Finland and then a bit here and there, and lately at the university. I was very fond of UNESCO's Delors report. And, you know, if I now look back and revisit the competencies there, I can see that, okay, it's quite the same what we need in the society when we talk about ethics or research orientation or competencies or coping with the uncertainty. But then, of course, if I reflect, even the Finnish teachers and my peer colleagues from the basic education, sometimes we have challenges to cope with all these things in the context. So that's why I want to ask something about the context and to maybe to see the difference, because when Professor Mythili, you said that in India, especially lately, the discourse of derision has been getting very strong. So the media, the society blames teachers to somehow to be responsible. And then from the Finnish point of view, this is now after the first time after the year 84, the teachers are on strike. And so I think there is more weight as the teachers are blaming the government that, you know, we want to have more resources to do our work properly because we have the competencies, but we can't now work and be accountable. But so in that sense, I would think about first Professor Mythili. What do you think about this standardizing is bringing? What kind of possibilities is bringing? You mentioned some of them, but now looking at from that perspective to teacher education, because at the same time we want to have the standards. You were mentioning this teacher eligibility test, and then we somehow, I think also when I now compare the situation in Finland and thinking of the teachers in the field, when things are getting very complex, when they are multidimensional, when we can see the life, the society, the needs of young people, we start to want to have standards. So in a way, I feel that sometimes the teachers want the standards. How do you see which are the good ways to cope with these two dimensions in teacher education in your context? Thank you.
So, please.
Sorry, go ahead, Professor Jari.
Okay, so the question about standards. So the standards are used widely in all over the world, and many countries have those teacher standards or teaching standards, and they are used for outlining what is important in teacher profession, but they are used more and more also in controlling teachers. So what teachers are doing, they are used as a starting point for teacher evaluation. There are external, like in South Korea, external evaluators are coming to the school and looking in the classroom what teacher is doing, how well he's working according to the standards. So in my understanding, the teacher profession is very difficult to standardize. It's not only creative or art type of work. It is a real professionalism in teacher work. So you should have a personal identity. You should have to have a competence for working in the classroom, but also competence in collaboration with other teachers, competence in your self-evaluation and that kind of thing. So in my understanding, it's really challenging to standardize teacher profession. And if we are standardizing it, then we are just looking for those what are in the standards. And we are only looking for those which are easy to measure. So kind of creative component and resilience, they are really difficult to measure. And that's why I'm not so eager to look for standardization. I am more eager to look for common kind of collaborative setting of aims, and then trust that teachers are following that kind of aims and they are supported and facilitated, and that the networks are nowadays guiding teachers to look for in consensus to that direction. So I hope that that was your question I was answering.
Thank you. Maybe, I was like tackling with the problem that when you meet teachers in Finland or teacher students, they would like to have the standards for their students to help their work. So there is this dilemma in Finland, and then also in the society, sometimes we hear voices that we can't keep this Finnish free system. Globally, we are otherwise being left behind. So
you are having standards for teaching and or learning outcomes description, then you are again measuring the outcomes and focusing to those easily measurable things.
Yeah, maybe just to think about that in Finland as well, we are all the time struggling and having dialogue with these inputs and outputs. And
you are correct.
Society,
of course, it's not black and white.
Yeah,
we are in the middle. Yeah.
May I respond, Pasi?
Yes, please.
I would like to differentiate between standardization and standards. As you're pointing out, there are quite a few teachers themselves and teacher educators who say that standards are useful to define for ourselves what is expected as a profession, because it's easy to dismiss teaching as a profession in many conversations with people. And as Lottie has pointed out long ago, that there is this apprenticeship of observations, because everybody has been through the process of schooling. They think they know what it means to be a teacher and what it means to teach. So having said that, the problem really arises when we go beyond identifying these, as Professor Gyari points out, these sets of aims which you may conceptualize as standards, but the minute you start to attempting to measure those standards and evaluating teachers against those standards, so that is when the standardization process begins. So for example, if you look at the standards framework that is put out in the public domain by NCT within India, you won't, and no one will have any quarrels with it. You have a set of standards for professional ethics, you have a set of standards for professional development, you have a set of standards for professional knowledge and competence. So these are things that we do feel are essential. And in any teacher program, we do go by these set of aims and the set of outcomes that we want our programs to prepare our teachers for. But when it's different when a group tries to do this within a university setup for the set of students that come in for that program, against setting a set of standards for the entire country as diverse and as complex as India is. So that is where the problem comes. And when you start using the standards framework as a measure for teachers' performance, so it becomes very difficult indeed.
Thank you. Johanna, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you. I would like to just, to go forward to hear more. And then maybe about the context in India to ask Professor Dr. Mithil about, you mentioned early in your presentation about the National Commission recommendations from 80s and 90s. And then that somehow, if I didn't misunderstand, that the old curriculum, the content of the old curriculum reflected the interest of teacher educators themselves. And then now I'm thinking about the new national education policy, and there is this separate section for teacher education. And then comparing when Professor Lavonen was saying like how long process was to develop the teacher education kind of a framework, and then we have different universities who anyway even still have autonomy to stream it a bit after that. how do you see the possibilities in India in the teacher education now? Whose interest it might be serving in the future, or it's serving at the moment, and all these possibilities and maybe the pitfalls that you might face? Just want to hear about the situation more. I'm curious. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I miscommunicated that the earlier curriculum was pro-teacher educator. What I was trying to communicate is that the awareness that teachers and teacher education as a formal preparation of teachers is something that has caught the attention of the policymakers early on. So right from the first national education policy, this has been stressed, and the fact that teacher education is important to prepare teachers for the country has been recognized. Nevertheless, provisioning in terms of allocating financial resources has never been the case even now in the country. So the tension that I was talking about in the reform efforts, so on the one hand, teacher educator led curriculum reform efforts, but again it was not as widespread and consensus building as Professor Jari had pointed out in the case of Finland. So but nevertheless, the curriculum reform effort were led by a group of teacher educators, even if they were small and not really representative of the entire country, as against the policy directives that were largely prepared by the bureaucrats. So that was the tension that I was talking about. So in the present context, the fact that a separate chapter has been devoted in the national education policy is certainly is something that we're happy about, because it has been flagged off as a critical issue within the policy. The fact that teacher education quality has to be improved has been flagged off very clearly in the policy. But then again, the policy intent is not always supported by practice in terms of primarily resource allocation. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Professor Mythili. I think it's time to ask next person to join the discussion, Dr. Jyoti Raina, Associate Professor from the Department of Elementary Education, Garchi College, University of Delhi. Please, Dr. Raina.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. Both the professors today have spoken about conceptualizing teacher education quality in terms of standards, and Professor Ramchand spoke about the standards that India is moving towards. In this context, my question is for Professor Ramchand, that the centralized regulator NCTE has come out with regulations for teacher education programs on several occasions: 2005, 2007, 2009, 2014, 2018, 2019, broadly along the same structure, the components of norms and standards, in a standards kind of an approach. Now, these regulations are prescriptive, standardized, universal, and they follow a centralizing tendency. And overall, they make for a tight, centralized regulatory regime that does not cater to teacher education for diversity, which Professor Ramchand referred to, considering the diversity in our country. And on the other hand, teacher education for diversity implies, as Professor Lovinen has emphasized, that regulatory process standardized, and in our own Indian context, it can't be the same for each teacher education program or teacher education institute. So whom does the regulatory process address in a centralizing tendency? And Professor Lovinen has also talked about not adopting the one-size-fits-all approach. So my question is that, would you agree that diversity needs to be the basis for reconceptualizing a non-standardized regulatory reform of teacher education in India, and maybe we can develop plural regulatory frameworks. And how can such an alternative regulatory framework be imagined, which is not centralized or standardized, but contextualized to accommodate diversity in teacher education? If you could provide any concrete suggestions on prioritizing research work in the direction of building such a contextual regulation of pre-service teacher education, that's what I would like to know.
Thank you, Dr. Raina. That's a very important point that you have raised. Yes, so NCTE, ever since it was set up in 1988, so the primary reason why the regulatory body was set up in the country for the benefit of our Finnish colleagues was the fact that teacher education program was being largely offered through the correspondence courses, and there was a proliferation of substandard quality teacher education programs in the country at that point in time, the early 80s. So that is when the universalization of elementary education was started in wide scale in the country. And to curb the proliferation of the substandard quality of teacher education programs, the National Council for Teacher Education was set up in the first place. And within 5 or 6 years of setting up of the council, it did manage to bring down, it did manage to close down actually the correspondence programs. But on the other hand, it did not manage to bring down the proliferation of substandard teacher education institutions from coming up. So obviously there was a demand in the country for teacher education program, and since the state was not able to fulfill the demand, the private sector creeped in. So marketization actually became much more rampant after NCTE was set up. So in response to Professor Raina's question, so the norms and standards of NCTE in a centralized manner was really a way of the state responding to the fact that teacher education is taken as a public good, but without adequate provisioning by the state. I think the response of the state was really in terms of highly centralized regulation, and which didn't serve the purpose at all of quality of teacher education, as we all know. So definitely the going ahead, what we need now in the country, as you're rightly pointing out, is for devolution of this regulation. It's not to say that teacher education should not be regulated. It is a profession and it needs some kind of a regulatory authority, but the regulation must really be devolved to the local communities. And the district structures that were set up in terms of, for example, the District Institute of Education and Training, they could probably evolve as a regulatory body within the local community. And the standards really and the push for reforms in quality must come from the teacher educators community. And I think it is important for us to drive the reform efforts and bring in more consensus among ourselves in terms of what shape these standards can take on, and how would we like to regulate ourselves as a community and as a profession in terms of offering of the teacher education programs. Thank you.
So if I can have also a short answer. So this question is really important, but also at the same time really challenging. So I would like to emphasize what I said in the beginning, that the OECD emphasized that there is no right system and everything depends on the context and history and traditions and so on. So it is not possible to change ad hoc. I have seen some examples where a country or a district have made a radical change and it was a chaos as a consequence of this change. So we should think about this diversity or decentralization holistically. So I think the guideline that Linda Darling-Hammond gave us is the 3 point of views are important to think and discuss deeply. And the first one is the teacher professionalism and professional identity as a part of that. And in Finland, we emphasize research-based teacher education, which means that teacher educators community is very research-oriented community. They are active in international research collaboration, publishing international forums and apply research money. So that kind of research-oriented community, and as a part, the teacher educators who are studying in that kind of environment, they are also learning themselves to make research and apply the research-based knowledge in their planning processes, evaluation processes, and so. So the professionalism of teachers is a complex and include many point of views. So the kind of collaboration culture, common aims. So common shared understanding of the common aims. It is part of the quality culture. So common setting of aims at national level, at university level, at program level, and interaction between the levels is important. And on the other hand, kind of not quality control, but kind of collecting feedback from the students and from the municipalities, working life feedback at all those levels, the ministry level, the university level, and the program level. It's important. And then finally, the collaboration culture, and this includes also the networking and partnerships. In the context of teacher education, the partnership with the providers of education, the cities, how well we are working together in collaboration, our student teachers practice in schools. So that is the way how to do that. But in addition, there are different kind of bodies and meetings where we are sharing ideas. So there are these 3 views: the professionalism of teachers, common aims as a part of quality culture, and collaboration partnership culture. Together we can orient to diversity in aims and diversity in organizing teacher education.
Thank you. Dr. Raina, you have more questions, or would you like to comment the answer?
No, I have one question that comes from Professor Ramchand's emphasis on the push for reform that needs to come from the teacher education community. And as was mentioned just now, this is a research-oriented community that can set quality aims defined by some kind of a regulation. My question is that since teacher education is a complex field of study, that is not a unified arena, but it is divided into 2 subsets. The first subset is the professional practitioners of education, the teacher educators. That's the field that I come from because I teach in a university affiliated teacher education program. This is the first subset, the teacher educators. But there is also the second subset, which is the social scientists who are education specialists who are pursuing liberal studies in foundational disciplines in education in departments of various universities. Say, for example, the Zakir Hussain Center in Jawaharlal Nehru University, which has psychologists, sociologists, historians who pay attention to problems of education. So this division of the field into 2 kind of subsets often leads to a lack of agreement on the essential conceptual elements, due to which regulatory reforms or policy shifts are not necessarily always undertaken on a rational basis. So policy making players in academic-led policy discourses in India, for example, tend to identify with either of the 2 subsets. And these subsets turn into academic coalitions, which sometimes turn into constituencies with very specific views on regulatory themes like curriculum selection, faculty qualification, and what constitutes the study of education discipline in itself. What could be the research possibilities for a
Again, you're bang on, Dr. Raina, in identifying the key issue in our country. So this division is not unique to India. Again, for example, at the Institute of Education in London, the 60s. So you do have the case where, as teacher educators, for example, we are expected to take on a lot more pastoral role than is necessary for the faculty at other higher education institutions, where they do not require this kind of support for student teachers in our teacher education programs. So that definitely leaves us with lesser time for research when compared to our counterparts in the liberal studies. Now, having said that, and again, you're very right, so far in our country, at least the voice that has been leading in the curriculum reforms has been that of the researchers from education studies. And teacher educators have not yet started contributing for reasons that I've just mentioned as far as research is concerned. So I think it is time that we took charge of our affairs and again collaboratively build consensus on what are the key areas of research that we need, and demand that we be given the time and the opportunities and the space to take up these kinds of collaborative research so as to inform both the policy as well as the practice within the sector.
Thank you. Professor Lavonen, do you have a comment for this question? Do we have this kind of challenge in Finland?
You mean in the definition of research areas or in general the research? So maybe one comment. So it's important to recognize the kind of key areas of research that has been done in Finnish universities in education faculties. So, and it's important to establish a bigger research communities. This should be done bottom up, but also somehow also taking into account the field we are working. So again, in consensus is a long negotiations to recognize the core areas of research and then support the kind of communities in those areas and for example, in the making of proposals for Finnish academia and that kind of. So that progress has happened in Finland for, I think I was in administration some 20 years time. So almost this 15 years time we have been negotiating about the key areas of research, but it's not possible to give it outside. So it's a kind of long-term process we have to go on and come in consensus to the important areas, recognize them, and invest also resources and in those fields and support in those fields.
Thank you. Dr. Raina, do you have more questions?
I do have more questions. If nobody else has a question, I will go ahead and ask them.
Yes, please.
But I'd not like to take too much of time.
We have
okay.
time for one more question.
Okay. You know, just now Professor Lavonen spoke about locating teacher education studies in collaboration with schools. But again, my question is to Professor Ramchand. The Kothari Commission's report, which is the first commission on education in India that submitted its report in 1966, it lamented that teacher education is very isolated from school education. But in our country, school education is a very heterogeneous arena, and there are multi-layered hierarchies of access within school education. there are at least 9 different types of school systems in India. So what are the contours of aligning teacher education reform with school education when there are so many types of schools? Unlike the scenario that Professor Lovenon outlined about teacher education reform in Finland, which was very closely associated with school education there, our school education system is extremely heterogeneous. And again, this question is very resonant because we are at the cusp of restructuring of school education, which National Education Policy 2020 supposedly initiates. In this policy transition, there is talk about completely restructuring school education in a 5+3+3+4 system, which is a foundational stage, a preparatory stage, a middle school stage, and a secondary stage. So how do you see this lack of correspondence between school education policy proposals and teacher education reform at the current juncture of policy transition? Because our friends from Finland have just spoken that they took teacher education reform very close to school education. But when we try to take it to school education or close to school education, which is the school we are talking about, we have such a heterogeneous school system. If Professor Ramchand could shed some light on this.
That's why it's all the more important that we have devolution of power to the local level. So while I do agree that there has to be a common set of understanding at the national level in terms of what is aspired either in the school education reforms or in the teacher education reform. But for one teacher education program to cater not just to geographic variations within the country, but also to the different types of schooling systems that you're talking about, it's impossible. No one program can prepare a teacher to address all these different kinds of contexts. So that's the reason that it is important that we are able to design at the level of the university our own curriculum. And we can be upfront about the clientele of schools that we will be preparing our students for. For example, we are in Mumbai, and if we decide that the primary clientele of schools are the Mumbai Municipal Corporation schools, and that is what our program prepares teachers for. And because context matters in teacher preparation as well. And if we do not have the autonomy to design our own curriculum, and we are forced to follow a common curriculum set up by the Mumbai University, then it defeats the purpose. That is one part in terms of aligning to meet the needs of different types of schools, to come up with different kinds of programs where there can be a common element that is core to teacher preparation, but really the pedagogy courses will be should be more contextualized to the schools that we are preparing our teachers for. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect also, again, as you rightly pointed out, the lag between school education reforms and the teacher education reforms. So teacher education is forever catching up, or at least trying to catch up with the school education reforms. So again, it's important that we come forward, we meaning the teacher educators come forward as agents who try to push reforms in teacher education that are more aligned to the school education reforms.
Thank you, Dr. Raina, for your questions, and thank you for our keynote speakers. Before I call our next discussion, there's one question in a chat that I would like to ask now, and it goes like this: is teacher education program of integrated mode? India is moving towards a 4-year integrated program as per NEP 2020. Do you think that will help in upliftment of quality in teacher education?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
I simply do not know. So that is the problem. There have been integrated programs in the country since the 60s that is run by the Regional Institute of Education, but they have not been studied adequately in terms of what they have to offer. And whether the 4-year integrated program or the elementary teacher education program run by Delhi University, for example. While there are a few studies that do claim that the teachers who are prepared out of the DLED program do better than those who are prepared by the DLED program, which is the concurrent program, we still do not have enough evidence to make the claim that a 4-year program will be able to support teachers with adequate content knowledge in addition to the pedagogic knowledge to become a teacher. So I really won't know.
Thank you for your honest answer. Now I would like to call a project specialist, Avinash Dital from Aalto University, Finland, to raise some questions to our keynote.
Thank you, Pasi, for the opportunity. And also thank you, Professor Ramchand and Professor Lavunen, and also a previous discussant on extensive discussions and then inspiring talks on the more on the theoretical or more on the regulating part of the talk. Now I think from my also experience, I am more towards the practical side of the implementing things, and being a young faculty aspiring teacher myself, especially also for teacher training in the region, in both in Finland and also in Indian South Asian region. I would like to focus towards the practical sides of the implementation or the challenges, and especially I would like to touch upon something that Professor Ramchand had said in the slides, for example, on one of the challenges, such as on the fragmentation of curriculum. So, as we know, like there is so much of disconnect of the teachers, current teachers, between the foundation and methods versus the real application in the classrooms, in the teaching. So maybe my first question would be that what could be the solution space for future, or even now when we are into this network? So what could be the solution space where we could strive for closing that gap from foundation or methods to the practical implementation? And then another question to go with the same line to Professor Ramchand is, can you share us some of the best practices or some of the good examples from India, for example, where these kind of little initiatives of ground-up approaches that has been able to push either regional or national government plans for teacher education, if there are some best practices or good examples that could be shared with us. Thank you.
Yeah, so in response to your first question, how do you bridge the gap, as Dr. Raina and I were just discussing earlier, one of the ways in which this can be done is to keep the context in mind. So I would like to look at foundation as one axis. So the foundations meaning what you learn from the sociology of education, from philosophy of education, etc. In terms of the other axis as context. So what does it mean for a teacher to be dealing with, say, tribal children? What does it mean for a teacher to create pedagogically appropriate responses for children in an urban slum? So slum is basically underprivileged areas within cities in India. So these are very different contexts. And when you talk about the methods course, for example, you can't be generic about what works in a context. It has to be very specifically grounded and rooted. So context really matters. And when one teacher education program tries to prepare a teacher for, say, an elite international school, which is heavily resourced and where students have access to multiple kinds of exposure versus a child from a very poor rural background. So the context being very different, I strongly feel that teacher education programs should start offering specializations in pedagogy courses that focus on specific context. And the theory practice divide, really the crux of it is in how do you help teachers understand the context in which they will be placed and the context in which they will be teaching. So if you can find ways, we are attempting at Tata Institute of Social Science to design courses that integrates the foundational courses with the pedagogy courses in a particular context. I mean, it is still a new program. We've just launched it 2 years ago. It remains to be seen how we are able to bridge the gap. So I'm not claiming we are bridging the gap, but we're making a conscious effort to do that. And India is a vast country, so you were asking for examples of good practice. Of course, there are very many good practices across the country. To name but two on the kinds of grounds-up approach to bringing in more consensus about what is needed. So one, I would point out to a non-government organization called GINTL that is located in Jaipur, and they run schools for the marginalized communities in near the city of Jaipur. And the kind of approach, pedagogic approaches that they use in the school is extended to their teacher education programs. And some of those methods have found its way into the National Curriculum Framework 2005 that talks about reforming school education.
Thank you.
To answer your question, Avinash.
Yeah, thank you. I just noticed that, happily noticed that our fourth discussant, Dr. Rahika Menon from the University of Delhi, has been able to join our webinar. So, Dr. Menon, would you like to raise a question to our keynote speaker?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to listen to all of you and to also participate in this discussion. Am I audible?
Yes.
It is indeed fascinating to see the quest for standards, you know, in a time when, I mean, we are talking of standards, we're talking of diversity, we're trying to also think of context. Actually, if one looks at all these issues as somebody who is in the area of teacher education and who is also basically trained as a sociologist of education, so I mean, this quest of bringing in the liberal with the practice, the quest of bringing in standards with while maintaining diversities, matching up to the challenges of a national, questions and larger social questions with the local concerns of the classroom. I think this is a very, very challenging area, and it was fascinating to hear both the speakers, the keynote speaker and Professor Lavnonen and Professor Mythili. I had a few queries which actually originates from these contradictions of that we are facing, and we've had a long discussion on that as of now. But just a few things. I'm interested in, say, for instance, in a time when we are talking of edu business, when we are talking of neoliberal trends and across the world, and the quest for standards with reference to outcomes and outputs, while not looking at some of the questions of inputs, which is such an important concern, say, for unions or for teachers or for the stakeholders, both the students as well as the teachers. You know, how far can this shared vision be a consensus? Because we are talking both of shared and as well as consensus, which are in keeping in mind these diversities, keeping in mind these contradictions. How is this consensus possible? So it was interesting to listen to the processes that has been followed within Finland, and trying to have a shared vision. Obviously, the different stakeholders are looking at it from different angles. My question is, like if we could say, for instance, and Professor Mythili, if you could think of, say, for instance, how is it they say, for instance, we bring in a shared understanding with, say, teacher unions, and professionalization of the teacher identities, a very, very challenging area. But do we have some examples of that from any studies that have substantiated that? Or, I mean, even in Finland, say, for instance, how are the concerns of the unions aligned with the concerns for the need for a professional identity? That's one question. The other question is arising from what was presented as, different learning outcomes or, different reading levels of girls vis-a-vis boys in the Finnish context. Here, say, for instance, we know in the Indian context, the learning processes itself is so structured by the social, stratas. So, what is the possibilities for researchers to, to widen this gap? What kind of work is required to, to ensure that we align these interests? The third question that I have is with reference to, it's a very specific thing. Say when teachers go as pre-service teachers, go to the schools and they become part of the school systems, which may not share a vision for teacher education, which is aligned with what the school practices. Schools are practicing, say, for participating in testing processes, while the teachers may go with a larger set of vision and aims, which includes in creating an inclusive atmosphere. So how is this shared vision likely to happen? How do we bring the schools to share this vision with the vision of the teacher education institutions?
Thank you, Professor Mythili. There were several questions. Now you have opportunity to choose which one you start to answer.
I think I will go with the last question first, because the alignment of vision is something that we face all the time with our graduates, isn't it? They go with quite ideal notions of what it means to be a teacher, and with intent of bringing about changes in the classroom, only to be very quickly disheartened by the institutional structure and systems. I mean, one example, Vinash was also earlier asking for good practices. So Delhi University, I mean, both of you, for example, have also been part of this reform, grounded reform effort, isn't it, in terms of bringing the alignment of vision. So not only are you using schools as places where students gain their field practice during their program, but you also have consciously tried to support the university school network and engaging with teachers more closely through dialogues, through short-term teacher professional development opportunities. The USRN, for example, screens films once a week and invites, at least it used to happen fairly regularly earlier. So I think that is definitely a good practice, Avinash, of attempting to bring in greater alignment of vision between a teacher education program and school teachers. And there is research to indicate that if there is a sufficient tipping point, if you will, a sufficient number of teachers within a school environment who are invested enough with this vision of reform for changes to happen in the school system. So I think that aspect of schooling and reforms adequately. I won't say adequately, but yes, studies are definitely emerging in our country's context substantively. So there is definitely reason for hope on that area. Regarding your second question about how do we resolve deep-rooted tensions that have been there for quite a while now. So on the one hand, you have this aspiration for a common set of aims for the country, or a common set of standards that we would like the profession to follow. And on the other hand, we want teacher education programs to be able to prepare teachers for the very different contexts that they will be going in. And in such a scenario, how do you even think about bringing in consensus? So these are definitely very complex issues, and there are no easy answers, but I think we have to make a beginning somewhere. Again, as Dr. Raina was pointing out earlier, this conversation between those who are scholars in education studies and the practitioners, teacher educators, I think the dialogue must begin from there, and build a consensus, at least among the like-minded people across these two divisions, and begin to engage more with teacher unions. So again, in our country, teacher unions have largely been politicized, and they are less academically oriented than teacher unions, say, in Australia. I mean, I'm just randomly taking Australia as an example. You were asking about literature. Unfortunately, in our country, teacher unions are not studied at all. So there is one report from NEPA that has looked at the functioning of teacher unions, and they find that the union is really more focused on ensuring, which is important, the basic standards of salary and working conditions for teachers. And academically, unfortunately, the unions have still not started engaging themselves in. So I think, but we do have quite a few strong subject teacher networks in our country, and these are again very well established. For example, the Physics Teachers Association is almost 100 years old and quite active in the country. So I think the best approach towards this very complex issue of building consensus would be to begin with like-minded people and try to forge common understanding, and then expand this slowly as we go forward. So we could begin with the scholars in education studies and the practitioner teacher educators, along with the teachers, school leaders, and extend it to the subject teacher networks before involving the unions and so on and so forth. And your first question.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Professor Mythili and Professor Radhika. The clock is ticking, and I think it's time to do a short wrap up. A lot of interesting questions, and it would be very nice to continue this dialogue, but I believe there will be more webinars and seminars. Dean, Professor Anna-Maija, would you like to say a couple of words before we finalize the webinar?
Well, thank you. I mostly want to thank you, everyone. It has been really inspiring and enlightening. I was really impressed by the really high level of sort of scholarship and sort of this kind of notion that we can bring up these quite critical constructs and try to see how we understand them together, whether we see them differently. And of course we do to some extent, but to sort of clarify them in our minds and give this kind of what is the best thing of dialogue to sort of challenge each other. And there was this very interesting discussion about standards, whether they can be perceived in many ways. They can sort of build some sort of guardrails, some like professional ethics, but then they can be also used in a very mechanical way as measures of performance, which would not be sort of conducive to change or transformative learning. So that there's clearly an area where we stayed for a long time, which was very interesting. And we talked about the need for reforms, or I sort of had this idea that sometimes we don't know, like, where does the need come from reforms? Is it something to do with the practice? We talked about maybe having some problems with quality, where we want to sort of homogenize the quality to be more high or improve our teacher education. That would be one very reasonable cause for reforms. But then there might also be some other sort of national visions that is the goal of maybe revising the curriculum. And we talked a lot about how it's difficult to sort of align the teacher education and school education. I think to some extent it's also something that we struggle in Finland, although there is this sort of like national plan of how we do curriculum. There's always this step where we might get this kind of disjoint understandings of what we mean by the text that we have written in the curriculum, how it's really sort of understood when we get to the practice. So there was this idea that it would be great if we could sort of have the resources and also to have time for this development of shared understanding of the common goals, but maybe also understand that sometimes we just have to be a little bit sort of patient and it's imperfect, the way that the process will, where it takes us. Theory-based practice was one of the things that I felt that was strongly sort of put forward. So I think that we didn't solve the whole question of professional competence or standards, or how to see reforms. How can we sort of be not just bystanders, but sort of agents in that change, and how we can empower the teachers and teacher unions to be these agents of change. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. This has been very exciting and interesting. Thank you for the wonderful speakers, keynote speakers, and also discussions. The discussion and the comments, the questions that you made enriched so much. We are very grateful for all of your presence here. And thank you for the audience. We hope that you come again to the webinar series. But thank you for this time. Bye, everyone.